It is 2 o'clock in the morning, the 27th of April, 1865. 7 miles north of Memphis, on a Mississippi River swollen black and wide with spring flood, a steamboat named the Sultana is quietly tearing apart from the inside. Most of the 2,000 men asleep on her decks have no idea they have only seconds left. In a moment, this boat will cause the worst maritime disaster in American history. By many counts, it will kill more people than the Titanic, and it will happen on American soil, less than 2 weeks after the country's bloodiest war has finally ended. And the men who are about to die are not tourists or emigrants. They are soldiers, most of them just released from the worst prison camps in American history, on the very last leg of the journey home. Almost nobody has heard of what happened to them. This is the story of the Sultana, the men who should never have been on her, and the fact that after more than 1,000 of them died, not one single person was ever punished for it. To understand how they ended up on that river, we have to go back. April 1865. Robert E. Lee has surrendered at Appomattox. 4 years of war that killed more Americans than every other American war combined are finally, mercifully over. But the ending of a war is not a clean thing. Across the defeated South, tens of thousands of Union soldiers are still sitting behind stockade walls, in prison camps, waiting for word that they can finally go home. Most have been there for months, some for more than a year. To understand why what happened to these men was so cruel, you first have to understand what they had already survived. Andersonville, Georgia. Officially, it was called Camp Sumter. It was a wooden stockade enclosing roughly 26 acres of open Georgia ground, and it was never designed to hold more than about 10,000 men. By the summer of 1864, it held more than 33,000. There was almost no shelter. Men dug holes in the dirt and stretched scraps of cloth over them. A single stream ran through the camp, and it served as the water supply, the washing water, and the sewer, all at once. It was fouled within days. Disease and starvation did the rest. At the camp's worst, more than 100 men were dying every single day. By the time the war ended, of the roughly 45,000 men who passed through Andersonville, close to 13,000 had died inside its walls. That is nearly 1 in 3. The camp's commandant, Captain Henry Wirtz, would become the only Confederate officer tried and executed for war crimes after the war. The men who walked out of Andersonville were gaunt, sick, and in many cases barely recognizable as human beings, let alone soldiers. Not every camp was Andersonville. In Cahaba, Alabama, there was a prison the inmates nicknamed Castle Morgan, a stockade thrown up around an old brick cotton warehouse beside the Alabama River. It was badly overcrowded. Men slept in shifts because there was not enough floor to lie down on at once. And yet, Cahaba had one of the lowest death rates of any Civil War prison, only around 2 to 3%. Out of some 5,000 prisoners, roughly 150 died. Historians credit much of that to its commandant, a Methodist minister named Henderson, whom the prisoners remembered as unusually humane for the time and place. One of the men who survived Cahaba was a prisoner named Jesse Hawes, who would later write a detailed book about everything he had endured there. He was, by any measure, one of the lucky ones. He had survived capture, and he had survived Castle Morgan. He would also survive what came next, which is more than can be said for most of the men who would soon be standing beside him. Because in the spring of 1865, all of these men, the Andersonville survivors and the Cahaba survivors, were being marched and shipped to a single collection point on the Mississippi River to be sent home. That point was a parole camp near Vicksburg. Witnesses who saw the two groups arrive said you could tell at a glance which man had come from which camp. The Andersonville survivors were thinner, weaker, sicker. some of them little more than skeletons. They had come through hell, and now they were waiting, packed together on the riverbank, for a boat. The boat that would take them home was already on her way. So was the man who would decide how many of them were crammed onto her. Here is where the disaster really begins. Not with an explosion, but with an accounting problem, and a man who saw money in it. At Vicksburg, the United States Army was paying private steamboat captains to carry these released prisoners north. The rate was fixed by the government, $5 for every enlisted man and $10 for every officer. For a steamboat captain, a load of 2,000 soldiers was not a mission of mercy. It was the most profitable single trip he might ever make. And the man in charge of assigning those men to boats was the chief quartermaster at Vicksburg, a captain named Reuben Hatch. Reuben Hatch is the rot at the center of this story, and he did not arrive clean. Years earlier, while stationed at Cairo, Illinois, Hatch had been arrested and investigated for taking bribes in the purchase of military supplies. He should have been ruined, but Hatch had connections. His brother was the Secretary of State of Illinois, and the family petitioned powerful men, including President Lincoln himself. A civilian commission was appointed, and Hatch was cleared of the charges. Later, a military examining board reviewed his fitness and found him, in their own words, totally unfit to serve as a quartermaster. And yet, through the same web of political patronage that had saved him before, he kept his post. So the officer who would decide how to load thousands of fragile, half-starved men onto riverboats was a man the Army itself had already judged both corrupt and incompetent. Remember that, because the Army will forget it later. When the Sultana arrived at Vicksburg, her captain, J. Cass Mason, was in financial trouble. Mason was part owner of the boat, and he had been having a poor season. A full load of prisoners could rescue his finances in a single voyage. According to testimony that later surfaced, Hatch and Mason came to an understanding. Hatch would make sure the Sultana got a large load of men, and in return, money would flow back to Hatch. A kickback. The exact terms were disputed for the rest of both their lives, but multiple later inquiries accepted that some corrupt arrangement had shaped who got the men. And this is the part that turns a bad decision into a catastrophe. There were other boats sitting right there at Vicksburg. Other officers said so, out loud. The obvious, safe thing was to divide these thousands of men across several steamers and split the risk. Instead, an order came down that all the waiting prisoners should go on one boat, the Sultana. At least one officer, a captain named Kearns, protested the overcrowding and reported it up the chain of command. Others raised concerns too. It made no difference. The men who stood to profit from a full boat pushed back, and the men with the authority to stop it did nothing. So they loaded her. The Sultana was legally certified to carry 376 people. When she pulled away from Vicksburg on the night of April 24, 1865, she was carrying, by the most careful later estimates, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,400 people. Around 2,000 of them were released prisoners. That is more than 6 times her legal limit. Survivors described decks so crowded that a man could not sit down without another man in his lap. And they said the upper decks visibly sagged under the weight and had to be shored up with heavy wooden beams to keep them from collapsing. And there was one more problem. This one was hidden below all those men, in the iron heart of the boat. The Sultana had 4 boilers. Before she ever reached Vicksburg, a leak had been found in one of them. The correct repair meant cutting out the bad section and riveting in whole new sheets of iron. A job that would have kept the boat tied up for 3 or 4 days. Mason did not want to lose those days, or that load of men. So, a local boiler maker named R.G. Taylor was brought in to do something faster, to hammer a thin metal patch over the weakened spot. Taylor reportedly warned that the boiler really needed the full repair, he was overruled. The patch went on. And so the Sultana was cleared to sail with a bomb bolted into her engine room, a 2-day fuse, and 2,000 exhausted men sitting directly on top of it. For 2 days, nothing happened. The Sultana churned north, stopping at Memphis to unload cargo. The men sang and played cards and slept wherever they could find a few inches of deck. For a lot of them, it was the safest they had felt in over a year. They were going home. But the river was working against the boat the whole way. The spring thaw had swollen the Mississippi far past its banks, in places nearly to the horizon, the current fast and heavy. To push upstream against all that water, the boilers had to be worked hard, holding high pressure hour after hour. And the boat was carrying 6 times the weight she was built for. Every mile put a little more strain on a patch that a man had already warned was too thin. At about 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27, 1865, roughly 7 miles north of Memphis, the patch finally failed. 3 of the 4 boilers exploded almost at once. One survivor said it sounded like 100 earthquakes going off together. The blast punched straight up through the center of the boat, through the packed decks, hurling men, timber, and red-hot coals high into the black air. Hundreds were killed in that instant, scalded by steam or crushed as the decks came down. Investigators later estimated that as many as 400 people may have died in the explosion itself before the fire even started. And the fire started at once. The Sultana was built almost entirely of wood, and those scattered coals found her everywhere. Within about 20 minutes, the whole boat was ablaze, a floating bonfire lighting up the river for miles, which left the men who had survived the blast with one final, impossible choice: stay and burn, or jump into a freezing, flooded river in the dark. The Sultana carried exactly one small lifeboat. Survivors said that in the chaos it was shoved off the upper deck and came down on top of people already thrashing in the water below. That was it. That was the rescue equipment for 2,000 men. So they tore doors and shutters and planks loose and threw them overboard to cling to. But remember who these men were. Most of them had spent the last year slowly starving. Many were too weak to swim. Many were too weak to even hold on to a floating plank. Witnesses described whole clusters of men grabbing at one another in the water and going under together, and the current carrying the living and the dead alike downstream in the dark, toward a city that did not yet know anything had happened. Help was slow. It was more than an hour before another steamer, the Bostonia, came down the river, saw the burning wreck, and began pulling men out of the water. Then boats put out from Memphis. Survivors were found clinging to the tops of half-drowned trees and to floating debris, some of them miles downstream by the time the sun came up. But for most, it was already over. Bodies would keep surfacing along the banks of the Mississippi for weeks afterward. Some were never found at all. And that is the reason no one can give you a single, confident number for how many died that night. The counting was a disaster of its own, because no one had ever made an accurate list of how many men were put on the boat in the first place. The estimates ranged all over the place. A military review put the dead at around 1,200. A customs count put it closer to 1,500. Many historians today argue the real number was higher still, well over 1,700. And the figure most often repeated for years was around 1,800. So the honest answer, the one this channel will always give you, is that historians genuinely disagree. The most careful modern counts put the dead near 11 or 1,200. The higher traditional estimates run all the way to 1,800. What is not in dispute is that this was the worst maritime disaster in American history. And at those higher estimates, it killed even more people than the Titanic would 47 years later. When it was over, the country did what countries do after a disaster like this. It investigated. And this is the part of the story that gives this channel its name. There were 3 separate official investigations into the Sultana. On paper, that sounds like the system working. In practice, they tripped over each other. Each one guarded its own narrow patch of authority. None of them dug all the way to the bottom. And at one point, a commission simply lifted testimony that had been given to another. It ended up looking less like a search for the truth and more like a careful sharing out of blame, one that landed conveniently on the people least able to fight back. The first major inquiry was run under General Cadwallader Washburn, the commander at Memphis. Despite direct testimony about the kickback, and despite the glaring question of why one man had crammed everyone onto a single boat, Washburn's inquiry cleared the quartermaster, Reuben Hatch, almost completely. Instead, it laid the blame on a different officer, Captain Frederick Speed, the assistant adjutant general who had helped manage the paperwork of the transfer at Vicksburg. But not every investigator was willing to let Hatch walk. Brigadier General William Hoffman, the Army's Commissary General of Prisoners, ran his own review, and he did not soften a word of it. Hoffman concluded that loading well over 1,000 troops, by his count more than 1,800, onto a single vessel had been, in his exact words, unnecessary, unjustifiable, and a great outrage upon the troops. And crucially, Hoffman named names. He identified Hatch and Speed as the most censurable officers in the whole affair. He put the corrupt quartermaster right back in the frame where he belonged. It made no difference. In the end, only one human being was ever brought to trial for the deaths of well over 1,000 men. And it was not Reuben Hatch. It was Captain Frederick Speed. Speed was court-martialed, and in the summer of 1866 he was found guilty of neglect of duty and sentenced to be dismissed from the Army. He had always insisted that he had followed his orders, and that he had been given bad information about how many men actually remained to be shipped. And then, even that single conviction fell apart. The Army's Judge Advocate General reviewed the case and overturned the verdict. His reasoning is worth hearing because it is a small masterpiece of technicality. He argued that while the Sultana had absolutely been overcrowded, she had not, in the legal sense, been overloaded, because the overcrowding was not what destroyed her. A boiler had exploded. The sheer weight of the men, he reasoned, had not directly caused the disaster. And on that logic, the conviction was reversed, and Frederick Speed was quietly, honorably mustered out of the Army, which leaves Reuben Hatch, the one man that both a general's report and plain common sense had pointed straight at. So what happened to him? Nothing. By the time of Speed's trial, Hatch had already resigned his commission. As a civilian, he was beyond the reach of a military court, and when he was subpoenaed to come and testify, he simply ignored the summons. He ignored it not once, but 3 separate times. War Department officials themselves noted that a man refusing to appear like that looked like a man conscious of his own guilt. But there was no way to compel him, and nobody ever built one. Reuben Hatch was never tried, never punished, and lived out his life a free man. Frederick Speed went on to become a lawyer, and for the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, the final official count of the guilty came to exactly 0. So there is your accountability. Now the last question, and maybe the strangest one. If this was the deadliest disaster of its kind in American history, deadlier than the Titanic, right here on American soil, then why have you never heard of it? Why isn't it in every school book? The answer is mostly timing, and the timing is almost unbelievably bad. The Sultana exploded on April 27, 1865. Think about what was already filling every newspaper in the country that month. Lincoln had been assassinated on April 14th and had died the following morning. The entire nation was in mourning and gripped by the manhunt for his killer, John Wilkes Booth. and Booth had been cornered and shot in a Virginia barn on April 26th, the very day before the Sultana burned. So the story of 2,000 forgotten prisoners dying on a river in Tennessee had to fight for the front page against the death of a president and the death of his assassin. It never stood a chance. And underneath the timing was something heavier. After 4 years of civil war, after Antietam and Gettysburg and Cold Harbor, after hundreds of thousands of battlefield dead, the public had simply gone numb to enormous numbers. 1,000 more dead, even 1,000 freed prisoners who had already survived hell and were only trying to get home, did not break through. There was no wealthy passenger list, no famous names, no shipping company to drag into court. Just poor soldiers, an escaped quartermaster, and a war-weary country that was more than ready to look away. The men themselves never forgot. The survivors formed associations and held reunions for decades, and one of them wrote bitterly that to be so soon forgotten did not speak well of their government or of the American people. But they were old men shouting into a silence, and one by one, they were gone. Today, a small museum in Marion, Arkansas keeps the story. The wreck of the Sultana itself is gone from the river completely. Over more than a century and a half, the Mississippi did what it always does. It wandered, and it left its old channel behind. The remains of the boat are now believed to lie buried under about 20 feet of soil beneath a soybean field in Arkansas, miles from where the water runs today. A steamboat that once carried 2,000 men home, resting under a farmer's crop. Depending on whose count you trust, as many people died on the Sultana as on the Titanic, or more. And either way, she remains the worst maritime disaster in American history. Almost every one of those deaths was preventable. Men were warned about the overcrowding, and they loaded the boat anyway. A boilermaker warned about the patch, and they sailed anyway. And when it was finally over, and more than 1,000 men were dead, the country held its investigations, reversed its one conviction, let its prime suspect walk away, and moved on. Nobody answered for it. If a story like that deserves to be remembered, then that is what this channel is for. So if this story stayed with you, help make sure it isn't forgotten again. Like this video, share it with someone who should hear it, and subscribe. There are far more of these than there ever should have been, and I will be here telling the next one. I will see you then.